Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibuyers? Welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. Can we just talk about the fact that I just recorded 35 minutes of this episode without actually hitting record? So let's do this again, right? Day 21 in the Lori Vallow murder trial. Music fact of the day. Originally, Blondie's song, Call Me, was meant to be sung by Stevie Nicks. Love me some Stevie, love me some Blondie. But it's one of those songs that I can't imagine anybody else singing it but Blondie. All right, we're going to jump right in because today was crazy, y'all. The first witness of the day was Audrey Barattiero. Now, look, this is somebody who was in that circle. This is somebody that Lori called right after Charles was shot when she was in the Walgreens getting those flip-flops. None of that's coming in this trial, but if you've listened to the Crash Course or the Connecting the Dots series, you know that happened. And when Audrey came in, Lori looked at her, gave her kind of a big smile. Audrey did not look at Lori, by the way, not even once the whole time, I don't think. But Lori was all in this testimony. So Audrey's from Missouri. She met Lori at a conference in November of 2018, and Lori offered her home as a place to stay. We know that Zulema, Melanie Gibb, and Chad stayed there. She said Chad slept on the other side of the house, and she saw every once in a while Chad and Lori would look at each other, and there was a vibe there. But she said they weren't flirtatious, and she thought maybe they had just known each other previously. She next had contact with Lori 3 months later in February, and Chad asked Audrey to be Lori's friend. He said she needed a friend, and he couldn't talk to her all the time, and maybe she could uplift Lori. So they talked for every few weeks for the most part. They got to know each other and talked mostly about spiritual things. She next saw Lori in person in the summer of 2019. That was at an event that was scripture-based in Utah. Now, she was asked, why couldn't Chad talk to her a lot? Well, we know he was married. Lori stayed in a hotel when she went to that conference in Utah with Zulema, Melanie Gibb, and, quote, others who weren't specified. But at the end of the trip, she brought up wanting to work on her husband, Charles. Audrey says close to that time, Lori, out of the blue, brought up all the stuff about zombies and possession, and that's something Audrey had never heard of before. This was in Lori's hotel room, by the way, where this discussion happened. She said they eventually talked on the phone about zombies and things Lori said she had learned. She asked Audrey her thoughts, and Audrey told Lori it made her feel uncomfortable. She told Audrey it was when people had a bad spirit connected to them, and then she had brought it up again at this visit at the hotel. She said people were chatting, and Lori said she wanted to work on getting a negative spirit out of Charles. And at first, everyone started holding hands, and Audrey did not know what was going on at the time. Audrey thought at first it was just a group prayer, and Lori said they were getting a spirit out. Lori said things like knives and fire, and she would list weapons that they would need to use to get the spirit out. I think these are like fake spiritual things, not actual. Audrey did not know the term casting, and when it got to Audrey for her turn, she didn't feel comfortable and didn't say anything. So when the casting was over, Audrey left, and their friendship continued. She also talked to Chad over the phone sometime. She had met Chad at an event in St. George, and she watched his speech and bought 3 of his books. 2 months after that, she had met Chad. She connected with him on Facebook. She had questions about his book, and they would talk over the phone as well. Audrey and Chad would mainly talk about religious things. So when she and Lori discussed Lori moving to Rexburg, Audrey asked how Tylee was. And she had met Tylee in 2018. And so she would just occasionally ask how Tylee was doing and thought Tylee was in college. And Lori said, Tylee doesn't talk to me much these days. And she said she had briefly met JJ. She also had met Tammy Daybell. Audrey was going up to Idaho, so Tammy, Chad, and Garth wanted to go out to dinner with her, and she said she liked Tammy very much. At one point, Chad told her about his near-death experience, and he told Audrey, a deceased relative told him Tammy would die before she was 50. This is before Tammy was dead, back in January, February 2019. This is kind of when things are going hot and heavy with her, with Lori and Chad. I mean, at this point, you got the chaos with Charles going on. And I can't believe people who knew Tammy did not go to her and say, like, do you know your husband's telling everybody you're not going to live to see 50? Because if you remember yesterday, the neighbors also said the same thing. But Chad told Audrey he would eventually remarry, and then later he said it would be to Lori. So Audrey asked, well, have you talked to Tammy about this? And Chad said yes. They talked to her about Lori and Chad's prior probations, and he said he had been Methuselah and Apostle James at the time Jesus was alive. He said Lori was also around during these times, and they were married, and they were Lena and James, and the wind fire was happening back in those times. So Lori came to visit her in Missouri, and Lori and Melaniece asked to come to see the historical church sites. Now, this is the time frame when Tammy Daybell is shot at. They told Audrey they just had some free time, and that's why they wanted to visit. No, you were establishing your alibi, lady. Audrey stayed the night with them in their hotel, and she said she first heard Lori use the term zombie in the summer of 2019. They discussed light and dark spirits. Chad said it would gauge if a person was good or bad. She talked to Lori about who was dark. And according to Lori, Charles, Tylee, JJ, and Tammy were dark spirits. Charles, she said, was dark earlier in their friendship. And then Tylee, JJ, and Tammy were later, right before she says she dissolved the friendship. Here's another thing. Lori also said that one or two of Melaniece's kids were dark spirits. That is scary. At the hotel, she said it was going great and brought up the idea of working on Tammy Daybell. She said Tammy was possessed by a spirit and it needed to be taken out. And Audrey said she didn't want to participate. At this point on the stand, Audrey's getting very emotional. And Lori said, you're my friend. You're supposed to help me. Audrey said she didn't do those things, but she would say a prayer for God to help Tammy and to help Tammy feel the love of God. She said at this point, they were not holding hands. And Audrey said this was at the end of the friendship. And according to Chad, if the spirit was in a body, essentially they were being held in a cage. This was regarding Charles specifically. Now, Audrey, she was in Europe when Charles was murdered. To Audrey, she said if the castings didn't work, Lori would just come up with a new idea of how to do them. So Lori texted Audrey, we got the spirit out, but another got in and asked Audrey if she had any ideas. And she said, I don't know why Lori would ask me for help. She had no insight into this stuff. Lori said Tammy's spirit was in a cage or in a jail, and she needed to be freed and helped because her body had been taken over. Audrey said she heard Chad say, while the body is still alive, speaking of Tammy, Audrey realized that they had a very different idea and they were taking this even further. They didn't intend for that person to be helped. They didn't want Tammy to live. So why didn't you call Tammy or the cops or something? I'll never get it. In October, after Lori and Melaniece visited, she went to Hawaii with Lori, and this is when Tammy was murdered. Melaniece and Lori picked her up from the airport, and they stayed in a hotel together. She described the trip as being uncomfortable, and she said Melaniece was having a hard time and needed a friend, so that's why Lori invited her. And Audrey said, yeah, I could be your friend. Look, y'all, I could be anybody's friend in Hawaii. Anybody in Hawaii need a friend? I'm your girl. Lori told Audrey that Tammy had died, so Audrey at this point on the stand, she's crying. Lori said it had been a week ago, and Audrey asked, how did she die? And Lori said, in her sleep. While they were in Hawaii, they rode bikes and stayed on the beach for the most part. She said Lori was agitated and snippy to Melaniece, and then she would be happy at other times. She hadn't seen Lori act like that in the few times she had seen her before this trip. She noticed there were times Lori would get a phone call and would disappear for quite a while. And so Audrey would sit with Melaniece, and she also talked to Chad while she was there. Lori left Hawaii a few days after, and Audrey said she told them she was going to go home, but Melaniece didn't want to go. Even by the end of the trip, Melaniece was having a hard time, so Audrey offers to go to Idaho with her. Audrey said she also wanted to pay her respects to Garth in person because she knew that Garth was very close to his mom, and she also wanted to pay condolences to Chad. So she stayed in Lori's townhouse, and she said while she was there, Lori and Chad were just kissing and hugging. Melaniece also stayed in one of the rooms at Lori's townhouse, and Chad would be over. He would kind of come and go, but he would come late at night and spend the night. While she was there, they went to the temple in Rexburg, her, Lori, Chad, and Melaniece. The defense is up for cross, and this is Mr. Archibald. He talks about spending time with Lori and Chad in 5 different states, and she says yes. So he asks a little bit about her personally. She's LDS. She's 34, single, works remotely for customer service. And the conferences that she referred to in her testimony were preparing a people. So Mr. Archibald goes back through meeting Chad and buying his books, and she said they were fictional accounts, but Chad had said they were based on some ideas and spiritual experiences he and others had. And the scriptures say the end of the world will be both happy and sad. So the preparing of people focused on the end of the world as being happy. And Archibald has a very dry sense of humor, and sometimes he cracks me up. I'm just going to put it out there, y'all. He said, well, what's the point of being prepared to be happy when Jesus returns? And she said, well, you're going to be happy because you're going to be with God and family. So he asked if she ever met Alex Cox, and she said it was once in Idaho at the end of the friendship. She also met Charles Vallow once, and he seemed very nice. That would have been in November of 2018. The defense asked, did he look possessed? And she's like, nope. So then Archibald refers to the Bible and Jesus casting out evil spirits. Audrey said when they did it to her, it was sudden and she had never done that before. And she said she didn't even know if they were asking Jesus to cast out these spirits. And so Mr. Archibald says, well, who were you praying to if it wasn't Jesus? And she said the method they used didn't seem like a prayer at all. He asked if they were calling on the devil, and she said the words that they used were very aggressive. And so Archibald says, this is the first time you meet these ladies, and you don't think this was a prayer to Jesus? And she said she didn't know. She's asked if she was worried for Charles. And then he says, did you call police or like an elder in the church or anybody? And she said, no. He says, if you thought they're weirdos, you never wanted to hang out with them again. And she said, I didn't know what to think about it. So he asks if she said, hey, this is stupid. Let's not do this. And Audrey said, no, I just left. So Archibald says, but you keep getting together with them. And she said, I wasn't in communication with Melanie Gibb and them. Them, I'm assuming, would be like Melaniece and Zulema. And then he asked, did you ever think Chad was a weirdo and maybe he's leading me astray? And she said at the end of the friendship. So Mr. Archibald said, okay, so October 2019. And she says, yes. But he says, in the summer, you were still a fan of Chad's. She said at the time she thought Chad was doing good things. So Archibald says you called, texted, and Facebooked with him, and he asked if she thought he was a spiritual leader and she needed to follow him. She said she thought he had answers. And Mr. Archibald said, and other women may want to follow him, like Lori Vallow, Melanie Gibbs, Zulema, and the witness says yes. And I think that was kind of one of those things that he snuck in, which is getting into the jury's ears that Chad, God knows how he did it, Mr. Plaid Shirt, Loin Fire Man, was persuasive with women. But, cult leaders, what they do is they find vulnerable people, and that's who they prey on. And I really do think if you pick apart everybody in this group, they were very vulnerable to a point. Not saying they were vulnerable and just at his mercy. Lori and Chad were gasoline and fire. But, I mean, come on. Somebody told me they were like Jesus' brother in a past life. I'm going to tell him to move on. But when Chad told her about past lives, she said she wanted to learn more about that. So Mr. Archibald said, well, Chad told you he was a prophet in the Old Testament and you believed him? And she's like, yep. And then in another life, he said he was an apostle of Jesus and you believed him? And she's like, yep. So then Mr. Archibald about got me kicked out of court because I thought I was going to bust out laughing. Chad said he lived over millions of years and regenerated all these great people. Did he ever say, hey, I was a loser in the 1700s? And she says, no. Chad told you he and Lori walked with Jesus, and Chad told you that you were married to Jesus and you believed him? And she's like, yep. Chad said her name was Joanna, by the way, when she was married to Jesus. I didn't think Jesus was married. I need to probably go back to church. I don't even know. He wasn't married, was he? I don't know. Audrey said she thought it could be true because she trusted him. When asked if she thought Chad was right, she said yes. She thought he could predict the future because he was telling people about past lives, and it made her feel like she was somebody, and that's the key right there. I think that's the thing. You look with Lori, you're a goddess, you're powerful, you're here to lead the 144,000. Zulema, you got firepower, you can call earthquakes. You make these people feel like they got power, and then it's like they're addicted. I mean, Lord have mercy, y'all. When you think it can't get weirder and then you just sit and think about this case, it gets weirder. She moved to Missouri because she prayed about it and felt like that's what she should do. And Mr. Archibald said, is it because Jesus was supposed to come to Missouri? Did Chad tell you that? And she said, that's a belief of the LDS church. And Archibald says, well, not Jerusalem. There's an objection that's sustained. And then he asked about the visit to Missouri. And that's where they went to visit places the pioneers of the LDS church had been to in the 1840s. And Archibald said, well, they were kicked out of Missouri, and then there was an objection that was sustained. So they went to the place where Adam was believed to have lived after he was kicked out of the Garden of Eden. They also went to the Kansas City Temple and the Liberty Jail, which is where Joseph Smith was put in jail. So Mr. Archibald says in October, while in Missouri, they did another casting for Tammy. And Audrey said she didn't understand, but she did personally pray to Heavenly Father for him to help Tammy. And Archibald said, so you prayed to help? And Audrey gets emotional and says yes. And he says, if they were holding hands while doing this? And she says no. I mean, y'all, Lori, I have like 50 times here. Lori is all in, paying attention. She said the term zombie came from Lori as far as she remembers, and the light dark scales came from Chad. So Archibald asked if that's a way to predict if you should live or die. And she says no. And so he asked her, what was your score? I didn't remember it, but Chad told her it was very high on the light scale. I think also Audrey was high on the trust list that he made for Lori. So she ended the friendship when she left Idaho there in October 2019. And he said, you were so uncomfortable in Hawaii that you went to Idaho with him. And she said, Melaniece was having a hard time. Audrey said, I have a big heart. I really wanted to help her. And this cross I have in my notes, it was really getting the jury's attention. They were very engrossed in this. He said, so you went to Temple in Idaho because you were their friends. And Audrey said, I wanted to go because it's a place of peace. So on redirect, they point out you weren't with Chad in Hawaii or Missouri, so not 5 states like the defense said. The castings were done in Lori's hotel rooms. She talked to Audrey about casting and who they needed to work on. Lori organized it. Lori picked the target, and the witness says yes. Good move by the prosecution to show Lori as the instigator and not the puppet of Chad's that was leading these castings. So they talk about Charles, and she found out later that Charles had died. And then a casting on Tammy, and she died. And Audrey said, yeah, they were working on their own doing these things. You know, everybody who's been in this inner circle has minimized their role while up on that stand. And I get it. It's embarrassing. You know, you look and I'm sure years pass now, over 3 years have passed, and these people can look back and say, what was I thinking? But still, a lot of these people knew stuff was going on, knew people were dying, and did nothing. It blows my mind. So the state asked, when you ended the friendship, were you scared? And she said a conversation where Lori threatened her. Now I'm going to tell you, Lori perked up and like put her arms on the table and was listening. And Audrey said Lori threatened to kill her. In October 2019, at that last visit in Idaho, Audrey said she had prayed about it and felt like she needed to end the friendship. And it was just her and Lori in the townhome at the time. So Audrey said she was going to go pack her things and go to bed early. And she asked Lori, is there anything weird going on? And Lori's like, what do you mean? And Lori says, no. Well, at this point on the stand, Audrey's crying, and Audrey turns to go to the stairs. And she says, Lori starts laughing. And she says, you're so naive and too trusting. You're like a child. You believe anything. You think the world is all unicorns and rainbows. You go around helping people. And then Lori said, I'll cut you up and put you in garbage bags. And Lori said she wasn't in the mental place to do it at the moment, but she would get herself in the mental place to do it. Now, Audrey is sobbing on the stand. You can barely make out what she's saying. And then there was something about the kids not seeing blood and something about bleach. And she said she would bury Audrey where nobody could find her. So Archibald's back up. He says this diabolical conversation in 2019 in Idaho. He said he lists all the places that Audrey had been with Lori, and then you decide it's time to go home to Missouri. She said she didn't follow Lori around, and Archibald said, you followed her. And then she starts laughing and talks about rainbows and unicorns and said she wanted to cut you up and put you in trash bags. Why? And then Archibald said, did she say, hey, I killed my kids. I killed Charles. I'll kill you too. And Audrey said she talked about being at the scene. And y'all, I'm telling you this right now. It was hard to understand, but this is what I heard. And I will check with Nate and Brian Enton to see if I'm wrong about this. But she talked about being at a scene and seeing someone taking their last breath. Lori did. But then Archibald comes in hard here. He says, so in grand jury, you took an oath to tell the truth, and you said nothing about this. Lori said, now this is what Audrey said. Lori told her, if you tell anyone, I will find you in the dark of night. And Archibald said, you expect the jury to believe you were so scared you didn't testify about it previously. And then he just essentially says, You want this jury to believe you made this last crap up. Those were his actual words. And then he was done. I mean, Lori looked shocked when Audrey said that, like absolutely shocked. It was a look I have not seen from her before. It's interesting. When I tweeted this out, I've had a lot of back and forth. A lot of listeners feel like it was credible. She was very upset on the stand. A lot of people kind of feel like maybe she made it up. I have no clue. But the next witness on the stand comes from Fremont County, and it is Detective Vincent, Kaikumanu. Beautiful last name. Wow. So he's with the Fremont County Sheriff's Office. And by the way, he is a sharp dressed man. We were talking about this after court day. He is now a sergeant who oversees detectives and the school resource officers. But the morning that Tammy Daybell was murdered, he got a phone call. He was the on-call detective. However, he missed that first call because he had been in Idaho Falls assisting with an officer-involved shooting, and he was asleep. But he did call back an hour and a half later. At that point, they had already talked to Detective Mattingly since they could not get him, and Detective Mattingly has already testified in this trial. He said there was nothing suspicious about Tammy's death reported to him, and he had never heard of Tammy before this. And so he knew later on they started the investigation into her death just a couple of weeks after her murder at the end of October of 2019. But he came into this case at the end of March 2020, and he was aware of the other investigations revolving JJ, Tylee, Charles, and Brandon. And he also assisted into the investigation into JJ and Tylee. So then he also, of course, learned about the attempt on Tammy, and he reviewed that incident and the documents from Tammy's phone and email. There was a communication between Tammy and her son, Mark. This came from Tammy's email. The email is from October 13th of 2019. That's after the attempt, but before, just days before her murder. She's recalling the shooting attempt where Alex shot at her, and she thought initially Alex was Chad or Garth just coming out to help her bring in groceries. She said that he was pulling the trigger and she just heard clicking and it sounded like an empty paintball gun. And she said, I kept asking what he thought he was doing. And she said at that point, she was more annoyed than scared. She said, my scared part came after when I thought what could have happened. She said she yelled for Chad and then the guy ran around the house. So she ran in the house and she said, I got Dad and Garth. They looked but couldn't find the person and they called the police, and they suspected it was a bipolar teenager who lives around the block. But then she says Matt Price has a better theory. Well, they stopped reading the email at that point. He also looked at information from Alex Cox's Homer J. Maximus Google account. That's the one that's given the wealth of information about where the kids' bodies were buried, and has really, I think this account right here has been the smoking gun in this case by far. So they do a PowerPoint of Alex's searches on October the 1st, directions to Mesa from the Gallup, New Mexico area. This address was Brandon's, by the way. And then on the 2nd, he searches the same address, but for directions how to get there. And that was the last time that was searched. Important to note, that's the date that he was shot at. Brandon was at that address. The day before the attempt on Tammy, he searched for 6.5 Grindle drop from 100 to 200 yards and then 100 to 300 yards. The witness said he really thought Alex was trying to figure out where to position himself to shoot Tammy. So the day of the attempt, he Googled AR-15 uppers, muzzle energy of a 6.5 Grindle, and then the Frog Tog sizing for pants. We know that day at the Sportsman's Warehouse, he bought those black rain pants. He also notices the day of the attempt that Alex was scoping the Daybell home with driving by. There was an objection. It was sustained. The judge told the jury, disregard that statement. So on the day after the attempt, remember, we only hear clicking sounds. She wasn't shot. There's a lot of searches about how an AR works in the cold. Now, way back when I did the Connecting the Dots series with Fruit Loop, I remember a neighbor had talked about how unseasonably cold it was. And it just was not the kind of temperature that people would be out in. So apparently this made the gun malfunction. And that's why she wasn't shot. He also searches on YouTube how to shoot an AR in 37 degrees below zero. Now, just to note, the temperature that day was 26 degrees for the high. So at night, I'm sure it was just bone chilling cold. Because I'm going to tell you guys, in April in Boise, my bones hurt when I stepped outside. I can't imagine. Like, I know down towards Rexburg is colder, I think. Then on the 12th, how to attach a cover to a ghillie suit. Lots of searches about shooting through car doors and windshields, and particularly a Dodge Dakota body thickness. And then how to drill baffles to make a suppressor. Now, what's significant about these searches? Tammy and Chad had a 2004 Dodge Dakota that Tammy mainly drove. They talk about the gun range visits by Alex, which he signed in as C. Quint, which was similar to his license plate. The visits were October 7th, 8th, 12th, 13th, and 15th. You know, it really just seems like he was maybe going to switch gears and try to shoot Tammy while she was in her car. But the witness had the firearms from Alex's townhomes, and they show some photos. Well, the defense wants the guns to be brought in the courtroom, and they had them there. He said that the gun that caught his attention was that Grendel gun because of those Google searches, and that was found in the townhouse. And so we know when Tammy called 911, she described that gun as a paintball gun, which what it is, the scope was so big on that gun, it could have been mistaken as a hopper. So what's a hopper? When you have a paintball gun, you have a storage unit on top of the gun that holds the paintballs, but this scope was so big that it kind of probably in the dark looked like this was just a paintball gun. And so the witness is familiar with AR-15s, and you can put optics on them and other accessories. And so that's where the paintball confusion came in, we think. They get into the email sent from Charles to Tammy and the one that Charles sent Chad about the affair. Of course, we don't know if Tammy ever read it. We do know his email was blocked from contacting her. He also got a geofence warrant. We've talked about those previously. It's those two bubbles around two certain places, and you see which phones cross into those bubbles and that kind of thing. So the bubbles were at the LDS church there in Salem, right near Chad and Tammy's house. I think it was just a little over 2 miles away from the residence. And he requested the bubbles from the 18th into the 19th, which is Tammy's murder. He also requested 150 meters for each location. So when law enforcement gets a search warrant for Google, they have a law enforcement portal and they enter in the warrant. Google responds, and then they get a Google ID number. Then they have to write another warrant to get which device that account is connected to and the name of the person that account is connected to. He requested 4 Google identifiers, and then he met with Detective Stubbs and went through the numbers and the geofences. They found 2 devices that overlapped. Detective Stubbs recognized a number off the warrant, which was associated with Alex Cox's account, Homer J. Maximus. There were 2 other numbers that had nothing to do with the investigation. He talked to both of these people. One lived north of the Daybell residence, so innocent people who weren't associated pinged in those bubbles and got a knock on the door. The device for Alex was showing he was at the Salem church from 10:07 to 10:45 p.m. on October 18th, which is the night before Tammy is murdered. There was another data point at 11:53 p.m., and that device was picked up on Wi-Fi 7 minutes away from that Salem church. Chad, interestingly enough, was not pinged in either location. Chad obviously was home because he said he was, but his phone never showed up. So Tammy's funeral, as we know, was on the 22nd of October in Springville, Utah. They talk about the 2 life insurance policies. We know Chad is facing insurance fraud charges for those 2 counts in Fremont County. So they bring the guns into the courtroom. There are also baffles and solvent traps, which are used to make suppressors. They kind of just like round metal tubes. And the detective steps down to where the weapons are. And Lindsay Blake just has him kind of point out this scope that is huge on this gun that could have been mistaken for a hopper. So that was the end of direct. And Mr. Thomas was up for cross. So he talks about the night or the day of Tammy's murder, the 19th. How many detectives are in your division? And he said it was just him and Detective Mattingly. The witness did not personally talk to coroners. He did not make the call that no other investigation was needed. When Fremont County got involved, they were asked to find the Jeep in the attempt on Brandon initially. And the witness is asked if they found any shell casings in the attempt on Brandon, and the witness does not know. Then they go back into that email that Tammy wrote her son, Mark. Now, the email is like 3 pages long, and there's another email attached to this. It's to someone named Shirley, and it's about church stuff. And he asked the witness how that got put in with the email to her son, and he doesn't know. The second page is Tammy talking about someone stole a neighbor's dog. The neighbor got it back and somebody went into labor somewhere along the way. I couldn't really understand that part. But back to remember Mr. Price's theory is the crazy dog lady came back to steal the dogs again. And the dog lady's husband was who Mr. Price thought could be that person with the gun. The witness didn't talk to the man whose wife stole the dog. And Mr. Thomas says, you didn't follow up on it? And the witness is like, no. And so Mr. Thomas is like, And then Tammy writes, I think I was a bit in shock because I said, what do you think you're doing? I realized it was a paintball gun with a hopper on it. He pulled the trigger while pointing the gun at me. I was more annoyed than scared. He was standing between me and the door, and he didn't say anything or move towards me. So Mr. Thomas asked if he followed up with how close the man was to Tammy, and he said he didn't investigate this crime. Mr. Thomas says, you didn't follow up, and the witness says, I didn't have the chance to talk to Tammy Daybell when I came on this case. He asked if this kind of gun makes a whooshing sound, and he said if it has a suppressor on it and a special bullet for guns with suppressors, it could make this whooshing sound. They did find some reloading equipment, but no subsonic bullets or casings, I guess, that you would use with a suppressor when they did that search warrant. The click could be from malfunctioning, but you would not hear the whooshing sound in that case. He asked about the casing and where it would eject, and he said if the gun's malfunctioning, it may not eject the projectile at all, and that's why you would hear that clicking sound. So he was not at that search warrant in January of 2020 looking for casings with metal detectors at the Daybell house. They found none. And so we go back to the email. Tammy said the thought crossed my mind to hit him with my clogging shoes, but I called Chad. He ran off. I got Dad and Garth. They looked outside. We called police. They say it may be the teen who is bipolar than Matt Price's theory. So they talked to people in the neighborhood about the, quote, bipolar teen, and it ended up he actually has autism and lived further away than they thought. And Mr. Thomas says, you didn't follow up with people it could have been, and he said they talked to the Prices, and that was it. So Mr. Thomas brings up the Google searches by Alex and the Grindle drops on October 8th and 9th. That's the date of the attempt. And Thomas asks when the gun was bought. He says he does not know, but the other agents investigating this would. So Mr. Thomas says, would it be uncommon for someone to search for these things if you own a gun like that? And the witness says, well, it depends on what you're going to use it for. And so Mr. Thomas asks, a 6.5 Grindle drop from 1 to 200 yards means your bullet will drop a bit. And the witness says with your scope, you have to dial that in to help with accuracy when firing. And so what Mr. Thomas is trying to do is essentially tie in these searches with just Alex being a gun owner, curious about certain things. And on the 10th was all the searches about using the AR in the cold. And Mr. Thomas asked if there were searches for other things. And the witness says he can go into what else Alex searched for. And Mr. Thomas is like, yeah, I want all of it. And the witness said, well, and I'm just quoting here, y'all. I don't care what people search for, but tranny and pornography and things that were not appropriate to bring into the courtroom. So that was things that Alex searched for. These were things that I found very early on. Me and Fruit Loop both in January of 2020. We found some websites that Alex was a member of on Tumblr that were kind of like barely legal things that he had searched for that we found, or sites that he was a member of. Just, yeah. So on the 12th was the searches for the Dodge Dakota, and the witness said Alex was searching for similar things also on that day, such as pornography. Mr. Thomas says you didn't investigate and you don't know who investigated the autistic teenager or the husband who stole the dog, and nobody talked to anyone at the shooting range who have maybe bumped into Alex there. And he says no. So they go into the geofence warrant for the church and the Daybell residence, and Mr. Thomas asked if the witness bothered to see how many feet 150 meters is, and there's an objection, which was sustained. Alex's phone was in 150 meters of that geofence at the church, and the phone showed Wi-Fi hits off the backside of that church. So on redirect, when the witness called the coroner the day Tammy was killed, Detective Mattingly had already talked to her, and he asked if anything was suspicious, and she said no. The detective is saying he knew of JJ back in October 2019. Now, Lindsay Blake was trying to get him to come around because at that point, we didn't know that the kids were missing. And she was gently trying to walk him through to show him that that date was wrong. But eventually, it kind of just moved on. So then they explain why this other email was attached to that one that was presented in court that Tammy had sent to her son, Mark. And so it happens with phone extractions. These emails will kind of mold together, and it's just how it comes to them. She asked if an autistic teen or dog thief sounds logical at who shot at Tammy, and he says no. They get no reports of mass gunmen in the area of the Dayball home on a regular basis or really ever at all. And in Tammy's email, she said it was nighttime. There's only a flashing yellow light in the area, or at least at that time, that was the only light around their house. So Ms. Blake asked if the gun is threaded for a suppressor, and the witness says yes. And she asked if that would change the sound the gun would make, and he said yes. So Blake asked why he didn't talk to Tammy about the attempt and asked, is that because she was killed 10 days later? And he says yes. So we were going to hear a motion outside the presence of the jury. One is about the guns admitted. Ultimately, Idaho law says bulky evidence can just be entered in using photographs. So both sides stipulate that. The defense said they do want them numbered differently because they will be used in Chad's trial eventually. Oh boy. Mr. Archibald said there may have been violations of the rule not to watch testimony or read anything about it. And I'm like, oh boy. And then they name Ian Pawlowski. And the defense received information. Melaniece listened to testimony, read articles, all in contradiction to the rule. Now they're married and came together. Their attorneys. Yes, they brought their attorneys, which, hey, you're entitled. Ian had violated the rule by talking to Melaniece, and she admitted she violated the rule. That was the argument. So they talk about, number one, we're not going to get to Melaniece today. They'll have to deal with her situation later, but Ian came in and his attorney, Garrett Smith, is with him. Garrett Smith, also Zulima's attorney, has already been there when she testified. Ian raises his hand, takes his oath. Judge Boyce explains to Ian witnesses cannot listen to other witness testimony, and the concern was actually brought up by the state. Ian said that Melaniece hasn't watched, but when Brandon testified, she read a headline and had concerns about it. He said it wasn't anything of substance, and Ian hasn't watched anything. He has seen headlines scrolling through feeds, but nothing more. Mr. Archibald is up the defense. They've been married, by the way, now for 3.5 years. And he asked if he was in the meeting when Melaniece was in a meeting with the FBI and Lindsay Blake. He was not. They now live in Mesa, Arizona. By the way, the last we had heard that they were still up in Rexburg. They got here into Boise on Monday. Melaniece said to somebody, and I don't know if it was mentioned who, the nail is already in Lori's coffin, y'all. Lori's eyes got like yay big. She was like, what? And then when he's asked why he brought an attorney, he said that this is very complicated and it just made him feel better. And he points out that his attorney was previously here with Zulima. And so Mr. Archibald makes sure that his attorney didn't tell him anything about Zulima's testimony, and he didn't. So Judge Boyce allows Ian to testify. So he's asked if he knows Lori, and he said he met her after he began dating Melaniece, Lori's niece, which is why I say Melaniece. For all you new listeners, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but we have two Melanies in this case, and they overlap. So Melanie Gibb, I call her Melanie Gibb. And then Melaniece, just because she's Lori's niece, I put those together. And he knows Chad and said Chad is married to Lori, and he met them both in person for the first time at the townhouse next to Melaniece's. He said Melaniece's relationship with Lori and Chad was close and supportive. And actually, Ian went to Chad and Lori to ask permission to marry Melaniece. He saw Lori less than a dozen times in person and even fewer for Chad. He talked to Lori without Chad present, and Lori talked about her religious beliefs. She discussed possession and locking Satan away. He heard her use the term casting out, and when the conversations happened, others were present, including Melaniece. Chad was present during these talks, but he said Lori typically did most of the talking. He doesn't think that she talked about multiple probations. Ian and Melaniece went to Arizona for Thanksgiving, and when they went back to Rexburg, Lori and Chad were gone, and they did not know where they were. Of course, he never saw JJ or Tally. He said he knew of their existence, but Lori never said anything about them. He saw backpacks and luggage belonging to kids in the townhome, but that was it. There were just no other signs of kids in the bedrooms. And he never heard Lori specifically mention JJ or Tally. He was open to hearing what Lori was saying. Ian said he's LDS and they believe in faith in revelation. He said the church is a living thing, and part of that is that you have to have an open mind. At that point in his life, he said he was going through a religious renaissance. He had went through a really rough divorce, and it took a few days to realize he wasn't open to what Lori was selling. The breaking point was the people she said were possessed, and the rankings of the light and dark spirits were alarming to Ian. He said it sounded like light and dark spirits couldn't change. It was predetermined when you signed your contract. Melaniece first told him about the light dark system, and it was referred to in a conversation with Lori. Some of the people Lori said that were possessed was law enforcement, poor Detective Hermosillo and Detective Hope. Ian was concerned, and things turned the morning after he got married. He said Melaniece just dumped her fears on him, and a mess was going on, and she shared what she was worried about with him. They were in Vegas, and his kids were with him. Now, they didn't get into this in testimony today, but Melaniece said that she acknowledged maybe Alex had took a shot at Brandon. Maybe Alex had done something to JJ and Tylee. But he explains they got married in Vegas. His kids were with him, and his daughter, they couldn't find her for like 15 minutes, and he was terrified. And she was actually hiding behind a curtain. They eventually heard her giggling. But then he said he had concerns for JJ and Tylee after Melaniece told him those things. He was worried about his and his ex-wife's safety, so he went to law enforcement December 5th or 6th in 2019. Now, they were married November 30th of 2019, so less than a week after their marriage, he's talking to authorities. So they asked Liz to observe and also to make recordings, and he did and gave those recordings to authorities. Chad and Lori never confessed to a crime, but it did have them talking about their religious beliefs on them. Lori and Chad told Ian to avoid law enforcement and not to cooperate. They said they needed to get out of town, and it was mostly Chad telling them to get out of town. He said Lori was a little more lighthearted about cooperating with authorities. And I have to say, Ian looked very solemn on the stand. You could tell the weight. You have to remember when Ian came in the picture, and we could sit here all day and talk about, well, they got married after knowing each other for 2 weeks or whatever, but Ian wasn't around really for a lot of this stuff. You could tell the weight it had on him today, and I'm not defending, I'm not doing anything. I'm just saying it was very obvious. Melaniece looked to Lori and Chad as a mother and father figure and was susceptible to their beliefs and open to them. She told Ian, this is what they're saying. What do you think? So the state was finished, and Mr. Thomas came up on cross, and he said the state has referenced the wiretaps, and they want to hear those, and that's going to be a big part of his cross exam. So the defense is going to review those recordings, and then we'll hear an argument in the morning outside the presence of the jury, and that finished up for the day. Tomorrow, we will stop 15 minutes early. There was something going on, so anyways, that was it. And I think they kept Ian's brief because he was not around for really any of this when he came in the picture. This was a full force. I think maybe if Melaniece gets to testify, and I'm not sure, it just depends on what happens with that, they're going to go really deep into with her. And I think maybe they've been kind of saving her for last, but this could be a huge rock in front of your skateboard if she's not allowed to testify, because I do think that her and Zulima's testimony is crucial to this case. So I'm very interested to see what happens after Ian's finished tomorrow on the stand, and that is discussed. So I will keep you updated on Twitter. I'm trying to hop over to Facebook some to post the more important updates. It's a little bit hard though, because it's testimony and I'm trying to like type and listen. But anyways, thank you guys for hanging out with me. Let me bring you the best of today's testimony. It was a doozy, y'all. It was a day. Some big revelations and a lot of reaction out of Lori I've never seen. Just shocked. 2 times she was absolutely stunned and shocked. And I think maybe hearing that Melaniece thinks the nail has been driven into her coffin, she couldn't handle that. But anyways, all right, guys, we'll see you tomorrow. Hope you have a good one.